Hi guys, my name is Yuri. I'm from the FACE group. We are a group that tries to translate research into clinical practice by posting some videos, some posts on Facebook, YouTube, and on Instagram pages. And we are here today in Brazil for the SONAFE conference. I believe it's the great post-physical therapy event we have all year long. And today we are here with Professor Tim Hewett. He just talked about ACL injury, and we're going to have a chat with him about a summary of his talk, and we're going to ask some questions about the talk. So Tim, first of all, thank you for being here in Brazil with us. Thank you for considering this interview. And our first question is about the risk factors, and you just talked in your lecture about some of the risk profile that athletes have for ACL injury, and I would like to talk a little bit about what are these risk factors, what are the risk profile that athletes have for ACL injury.
So to get at the risk profile, we first have to examine the mechanism, and that's what we've been doing over the last 3 decades. And in short, this is how you tear your ACL. So if this is my tibia, this is my femur, this is my fibula, lateral side of the joint, you get this combination of distal tibial abduction combined with anterior translation, especially of the lateral plateau of the tibia, which leads to internal rotation, and when applied very rapidly with a high ground reaction force, you get rupture of the ACL. Now, to look at both screening for risk factors and for interventions to reduce the risk, you have to always go back to that mechanism. So anything that we can screen for in an athlete that they do that relates to this movement, we can use to relate to risk or predict or stratify for risk. And we can also use that information to reduce relative risk. So what we see is athletes who are basically 4 things related to that mechanism. The first is what we call ligament dominant, and that imbalance that an athlete shows is related to hard ground reaction forces, flat-footed landings, where there's a high force, and instead of using the musculature, especially the posterior chain musculature to absorb and dissipate that force, they allow the force to go to the joint and to the ACL, which tears it. The second risk factor that athletes demonstrate is quadriceps dominance. And that's the overuse of the quadriceps muscle and the underuse of the posterior chain musculature, again, to stiffen and stabilize the knee joint. The problem with a quadriceps dominant athlete is the quadriceps has a single tendon that translates vertically, that does compress the joint together, but it also pulls that tibia forward. That's a risk factor, as we discussed. Whereas someone who's more posterior chain dominant, the hamstrings, for example, and the glute complex, they pull the tibia back, and they have bilateral tendons which can control that internal rotation component. So quadriceps dominant is the second big problem. The third big neuromuscular imbalance risk factor is leg dominance. Athletes who demonstrate very different abilities in neuromotor coordination, balance, one side versus the other. Asymmetries are always some of our best risk factors. And finally, the fourth factor is trunk dominance. This inability to control the trunk in 3-dimensional space and increased movement of the trunk during athletic maneuvers. And what that leads to is great differences in movement of the ground reaction force. And when the ground reaction force then goes lateral to the knee joint, it causes distal tibial abduction, and again, that combination of motions. So those are the 4 risk factors that are crucial for screening and for prevention.
Okay, perfect. And now that we know the main risk factors to addressing ACL injury, what kind of interventions we could use to address these risk factors and to reduce risk of injury?
So the good news is Dr. Kate Webster with Julian Feller in Melbourne, we've been collaborating with that group, and basically we did a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. So we took all the meta-analyses in the literature, and this paper is actually under review. And basically what we clearly show is with neuromuscular interventions that target those risk factors we just discussed, you can reduce the risk of a knee or all ACL injuries by half, and you can reduce non-contact ACL injuries by 2/3. This is a crucial aspect of that. Now, how are those interventions developed? Well, based on that mechanism. So again, anything that reduces this, and this together, is going to reduce the relative risk. So what we do is we go after those 4 risk factors that we just discussed that are directly related to injury mechanisms. For ligament dominance, we make an athlete more muscle dominant. So we use a lot of biofeedback training, a lot of plyometrics. So for those athletes that are quadriceps dominants, we use plyometrics and power training to turn on the posterior chain, strengthen it, increase recruitment of it, increase power on the posterior chain relative to the anterior chain. For that athlete that is leg dominant, we create greater symmetry. And the way we do that is sort of counterintuitive because we do a lot of single leg movements, but when single leg movements are performed and then compared to one another and a lot of feedback is given, it creates greater side-to-side symmetry. And this problem with trunk dominance, we do a lot of dynamic but foot-based core stability training that is going to translate over onto the court and onto the field, greater control of that center of mass, so there's not this great trunk movement, great movement of the center mass, especially lateral to the knee joint.
Okay, perfect. And our third question is about prediction. I believe you read the paper from Roadba a couple of years ago, I guess, and maybe he said that we don't have many tests to identify the risk of prediction and to predict ACL injury. What do you think about, can we predict ACL injury?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by predict. So it really comes down to a definition. If you ask a biostatistician, I had 3 top-notch biostatisticians on that paper that he addressed. Each and every one would say, yes, absolutely, we can predict risk. But of course, we cannot predict a single athlete. That's obvious. We can't say this athlete is for sure going to have an ACL injury. But we can risk stratify individuals with pretty good, nearly 80% sensitivity and specificity. So it depends on how you define prediction and how you use that term. For a biostatistician, yes, we can predict. Do I think we can predict an individual athlete? Not with very high fidelity, but can we risk stratify athletes into, say, low risk, moderate risk, and high risk groups? Absolutely we can. We just published a series of papers this year in AJSM that shows indeed we can.
And do you think we are going in the right direction in ACL injury research and ACL injury prevention and practice?
I think we are going in the right direction, and I think these 4 components have to be involved. To get at a problem, you have to get at the mechanism. From the mechanism, you then develop the screening factors. Now, the important thing is they need to be related, but they also need to be modifiable. So risk factors that you can't modify are not that useful. And then finally, what you do is take that information from mechanism to modifiable risk factor and then develop your interventions that are targeted toward those modifiable risk factors. And then finally, you have to have outcomes incorporated into your research to find out if indeed those targeted interventions are efficacious and really do reduce risk over time.
So, team, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate e enjoy Brazil.
The pleasure is all mine. Obrigado.
Thank you.
Fuck you.